this bill to the House.
Mana whakawa.
I call Nuk Koraka.
Ko te homua, ko te homuri. Ko te hou tama wāhine, ko te hou tama tānei. E tū mai rā te toko a tānei nui araki. E tū turi mau kia whakamaua ka tīna, haumi e hui e, tāheki e. E te mana whakawa. A ko tēnei pire o te Coroner's Access to Dead Persons Amendment Bill ka hoki ki te pūrongo a te Committee Whiriwhiri Take Māori. Ko te ui nā ki te āhei atu me te whakahaere a te whānau i te tūpāpaku. E te mana whakawā, the genesis of this bill was by way of an inquiry that was undertaken by the Māori Affairs Select Committee in the 51st Parliament. And tonight I want to acknowledge, first of all, the Honourable Matiria Ture, who was responsible actually for instigating this particular inquiry. Also, another party, Kakariki Wahine, now the co-leader of the Green Party, who was also responsible for developing the terms of reference, actually, for the inquiry. Also, what's important to acknowledge parliamentarians that are actually not here anymore, and particularly Marama Fox from the Pāti Māori, and our own Chester Burrows, and also Pita Pironi, who gave us so much wise insight into Te Ao Māori. Madam Speaker, all of these former parliamentarians were instrumental in guiding this inquiry to its very successful, we believe, conclusion. Can I also acknowledge the Honourable Andrew Little, who has brought this bill to the House, and in our appreciation as to acknowledging sort of one part of it, particularly the dignity that we have for the tūpāpaku. So, in light of the Māori Affairs Select Committee inquiry, we now have a bill before us tonight that amends the Section 26 of the Coroner's Act 2006, and what it does is that it improves the cultural considerations of the coronial system. Because currently the Act does not require coroners to take cultural considerations into account. And under Section 26, but they also have a discretion to do so. Looking at it and listening to the submitters, a lot of that discretion actually wasn't undertaken. So a number of the submitters actually reported that the fact is that they felt that there was actually a lot of cultural negativity during the management of a deceased person. Can I also say that the inquiry was initiated in response to many whānau regarding access and management to the tūpāpaku, as sort of culturally insensitive. So this particular bill and part of it goes quite a way actually to address some of those concerns. E te mana whakawā, I think it's also important to note that while the Māori Affairs Select Committee concentrated on Māori cultural aspects under the terms of reference, the inquiry, though, was not purely restricted just to Māori, but it was actually, we tried to cover all New Zealanders with an interest in these issues. So when the submitters did come, there were a number of ethnic communities actually that came to submit, and when we saw this, I mean, exactly what Māori were talking about was also what they were talking about and they were experiencing. So in regards then to the bill, I think this very much reflects the bill and hopefully the diversity, particularly that is reflected in the over 200 ethnicities that are actually part of the New Zealand population. And so I think, though, more consideration will need to occur as we grapple with the sort of component of the coroner's work. Can I finally just say that it was actually incredibly moving to hold this inquiry and actually listen to not only those that were whānau, but also to the incredible work that is done by the coronial services, also the police as well, medical, health, all of that, because they came with their stories, and to me, this is a reflection of the success of that inquiry. So for that reason, we support this bill to Select Committee, and I commend this bill to the House. Āpiti hono tātai hono rātou ki te honga mate ki a rātou. Āpiti hono tātai hono tātou ki te honga ora ki a tātou. Let the dead be the dead and the living be the living. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Right. I call... Are you called?
Madam Speaker.
I call Mark Patterson.
Sorry, as I just organised myself.